In 2011, the richest man in the world laughed at a Chinese car company. He was on television. A reporter asked Elon Musk about a company called BYD, a Chinese firm that made electric cars. Musk smiled. Then he actually laughed. He said he did not think they had a great product. He said their focus should be on making sure they did not die in China. The audience chuckled along with him. It was, at the time, a perfectly reasonable thing to laugh at. To Musk, and to almost everyone in the West, the idea that a Chinese company could ever threaten a Western carmaker was a joke. The joke had become a threat. Nobody is laughing now, not in Detroit, not in Germany, not in Japan, and least of all in the boardroom of Tesla, where that 2011 laugh now sounds less like confidence and more like a warning that everyone ignored. Because in 2025, that same company, BYD, passed Tesla to become the biggest seller of electric cars on the entire planet. Not in China, on Earth. While Tesla's sales fell, BYD's soared past it, and BYD did not stop there. It marched into Europe, the birthplace of the automobile, and started outselling Tesla there too, even with heavy tariffs stacked against it. The car industry is watching something happen that it swore was impossible. The West invented the car. The West perfected the car. For over 100 years, the West owned the car. And now, quietly, that 100-year empire is cracking. Think about what the car has meant to the West. The freedom of the open American highway. The precision and pride of German engineering. The car was not just a product the West sold to the world. It was a symbol of Western industrial supremacy, of what the West could build better than anyone. To lose the lead in cars is not like losing the lead in some obscure component. It strikes at the heart of how the West has seen itself for a century. Remember that laugh, the one Musk gave in 2011. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the company he laughed at became the thing he feared most, and why the car sitting in your driveway may be one of the last of its kind. If you enjoy stories about how the balance of power quietly shifts, and how the giants who feel invincible get caught off guard, hit like and subscribe so you never miss one. And this affects you wherever you live, even if you never buy a Chinese car, because the car is not just a product. It is one of the largest industries on the planet, employing tens of millions of people, holding up the economies of entire nations. Germany's wealth was built on its cars. So was Japan's. So was a huge part of America's. When the center of gravity of that industry shifts from west to east, it does not just change what is in your driveway. It changes which countries have jobs, which economies grow, and which ones decline. The car you drive is the tip of an enormous iceberg, and that iceberg is quietly moving toward China. What happens next in this industry will ripple through the global economy for decades. This is not just a story about cars. It is a story about where the wealth of the next century gets made. But to understand how shocking this is, you have to understand how completely the West once dominated the car. This was not a small lead. This was total. The automobile was a Western invention through and through. The Germans built the first one. The Americans, led by Henry Ford, turned it into something the masses could own, inventing the assembly line and putting the world on wheels. For the entire 20th century, the great car empires were Western and Japanese. Detroit, Germany, Japan. These were the names that ruled the road. Ford, General Motors, Volkswagen, Toyota, Mercedes. These companies had 100 years of engineering, of brand loyalty, of manufacturing mastery. The car was arguably the most complex mass-produced product in human history. Thousands of parts, precision engineering, huge factories, deep supply chains. It was considered almost impossible for a newcomer to break in. The barriers were simply too high. And China, for most of that century, China barely made cars at all. When it finally started, its cars were a punchline, cheaply built, unsafe, copies of Western designs and bad copies at that. In crash tests, early Chinese cars crumpled like tin cans. The world laughed the way Musk laughed. The idea that China could ever build a car that a Western buyer would actually want seemed absurd. So how did the West let China in? That is the twist, and it is a painful one, because the West did not just let China in. The West personally trained it. Here is what happened. When China's car market started booming, it was the largest in the world, and every Western carmaker desperately wanted a piece of it. But China had a rule. If you want to sell cars here, you cannot just ship them in. You have to partner with a Chinese company. You have to build factories here and share how you do it. It was a trade, access to the biggest market on Earth in exchange for knowledge. The Western carmakers agreed. They were making so much money in China that they could not resist. Volkswagen, General Motors, and others poured in, set up joint ventures with Chinese partners, and built cars side by side with Chinese engineers. For years, this looked like a brilliant deal for the West. They sold millions of cars and made billions in profit. But look at what was really happening. Every year, Chinese engineers were learning, watching, absorbing a century of Western manufacturing knowledge, learning how to design, how to build, how to run the supply chains. The West was being paid to teach its future competitor everything it knew. And when the students were ready, they did not need their teachers anymore. There is a phrase for this that Chinese strategists have used for decades: trading market for technology. Give foreign companies access to the market and in return quietly acquire their technology and know-how. To the West, it looked like a fair business deal. To China, it was a long-term strategy to build its own industry using its competitors' own expertise, and it worked almost perfectly. The Western carmakers, focused on this quarter's profits and next year's sales targets, could not see, or chose not to see, the trap. They were like a master craftsman taking on an apprentice, so busy enjoying the cheap labor that he never noticed the apprentice had memorized every secret he had. By the time the West understood what had happened, the knowledge was gone. It had walked out the door and started its own company down the street, and that company was undercutting them on price and beating them on technology. But learning to build a normal car was not enough to beat the West. A Chinese company copying a Volkswagen would always be one step behind. To win, China needed to change the game entirely, and it found a way. It decided to skip the thing the West was best at and jump straight to the thing the West was weakest at. It decided to skip the engine. This is the single most important decision in the entire story, so let me explain why it mattered so much. For 100 years, the hardest part of a car, the crown jewel of Western engineering, was the internal combustion engine, the gasoline engine. It is an incredibly complex machine, hundreds of moving parts, decades of refinement, the thing that separated a great carmaker from a mediocre one. Western and Japanese companies had a century of lead in engine building. No newcomer could ever catch up. So China made a brilliant strategic choice. It would not try. Instead of fighting on gasoline engines where it could never win, China bet everything on the electric car where there was no engine at all. An electric car does not have that complex gasoline engine. It has a battery and electric motors. And in that world, 100 years of Western engine expertise suddenly counted for almost nothing. The playing field was reset to zero, and China made sure it would win the new game before the West even realized the game had changed. Think of it like this. Imagine two runners about to race. One of them has trained his whole life for a marathon, and he is the best marathon runner in the world. The other knows he can never beat that. So instead of racing a marathon, he quietly changes the race to a swimming contest and then spends years becoming the best swimmer alive, before his rival even notices the race has moved to the water. That is what China did to the car industry. The West was the greatest marathon runner in history when it came to gasoline engines. So China refused to race there. It changed the contest to electric, jumped into the pool, and started swimming laps while Detroit and Germany were still lacing up their running shoes. By the time the Western carmakers looked up and realized the future was electric, China was already years ahead in the water, holding the one thing that mattered most, the batteries. Because here is the key. The most important, most expensive part of an electric car is the battery, and China had spent years quietly becoming the undisputed king of batteries. This is where BYD comes in and where the laugh really comes back to haunt Musk. Because BYD did not start as a car company at all. BYD started as a battery company. It was founded in the 1990s making rechargeable batteries for phones and electronics. It became one of the biggest battery makers in the world before it ever seriously made cars. So when the world shifted to electric vehicles, BYD already owned the single most important piece of the puzzle. While Western carmakers had to go and buy their batteries from someone else, BYD made its own. It controlled its own supply chain from the battery chemistry all the way up to the finished car. That is why it can build a good electric car so much cheaper than anyone in the West. It is not magic. It is that they own the most expensive part. And the story of the man behind BYD makes the whole thing even more remarkable. BYD was founded by a chemist named Wang Chuanfu, who grew up poor, orphaned young, and raised by his older siblings. He started the company with borrowed money, making batteries in a modest workshop, competing against giant Japanese firms that dominated the industry. He won by being relentless about cost. Where the Japanese used expensive automated production lines, he used people and clever engineering to do the same work for a fraction of the price. That instinct, doing more with less, undercutting the established giants, became the DNA of the entire company. When Wang decided to move into cars in the early 2000s, analysts thought he was crazy. He bought a struggling, tiny Chinese carmaker that nobody respected, and declared that one day his battery company would build the electric cars of the future. It sounded like a fantasy. He was, at the time, exactly the kind of person you might laugh at, and he spent the next 20 years proving the laughers wrong, building quietly the company that would eventually dethrone Tesla. The name BYD, by the way, officially stands for Build Your Dreams. For years, that slogan was mocked too. It is not being mocked anymore. And that changes everything about the price, because the results are staggering. BYD can sell a genuinely good electric car for a price Western carmakers simply cannot match. In China, BYD has sold compact electric cars for under $10,000, a real car, not a toy, while comparable Western electric vehicles cost 3 or 4 times that. Let that price sink in. Under $10,000 for a brand new electric car. In much of the West, you cannot buy the cheapest new gasoline car for that, let alone an electric one. For an ordinary family choosing between a Western electric car and a Chinese one that costs less than half as much and comes with more features, the decision starts to make itself. Loyalty to a brand only goes so far when the price gap is that enormous. And that is precisely what terrifies the Western car industry. Not that Chinese cars are cheap, but that they are cheap and good at the same time. This is not because BYD cuts dangerous corners. It is because it controls the batteries, it builds at massive scale, and it has a supply chain the West spent years helping to create. The result is an electric car that is cheap and increasingly genuinely good. The days of Chinese cars crumpling in crash tests are over. Modern BYD vehicles score top safety ratings, come loaded with technology, and in many cases feel more advanced inside than their Western rivals. And the scale of what China built is almost hard to picture. BYD alone now runs enormous factories, some so large they are effectively entire cities, with their own worker housing, their own infrastructure, employing hundreds of thousands of people. China produces more cars than any other country on Earth, more than the United States, Japan, and Germany. It builds its own ships now, giant car-carrying vessels, specifically to flood the world's ports with Chinese vehicles, because it is producing more than its own roads can absorb. This is not a company that got lucky with one good model. This is an entire national industry built deliberately over 2 decades, aimed squarely at the one prize the West thought was untouchable. The affordable electric car was not an accident. It was a plan. And the West watched it happen in slow motion, still convinced, right up until the end, that its lead was safe. Picture the scene inside a Western car company boardroom a few years ago. For decades, these were the masters of the universe, the engineers and executives who built the machines the whole world wanted. They had watched Japanese carmakers rise and adapted. They had survived recessions, oil crises, and shifting tastes. They believed deep down that they were simply better, that 100 years of heritage could not be erased by some upstart from Shenzhen. And then the sales charts started to turn, slowly at first, then all at once. Their market share in China, once a river of profit, began drying up. Their electric models, expensive and late, could not compete with cars that were cheaper and increasingly better. The masters of the universe suddenly found themselves playing catch-up against a company their most famous rival had laughed at on television. That is a very hard thing to accept when you have been on top for a century. Now this is the moment I have to be completely honest with you, because this channel does not deal in fantasy. The Western car is not dead. Let me be clear about that. In early 2026, when China cut some of its electric car subsidies, Volkswagen actually clawed back the top sales spot in China for a while. Tesla still dominates the electric car market in the United States. Western brands still carry enormous prestige, and hundreds of millions of people still drive, love, and trust them. So this is not the funeral of the Western car. Not yet. What is actually happening is something more important than a single company winning or losing a single quarter. It is a permanent shift in who holds the power. For 100 years, if you wanted a good car, you looked west or to Japan. That was simply a fact of life. That fact is now over. For the first time in the history of the automobile, some of the best, most advanced, and most affordable cars in the world are coming from China. The monopoly on knowing how to build a great car, the thing the West guarded for a century, is broken. And the numbers tell the story in black and white. In 2025, BYD outsold Tesla globally in electric vehicles. Its sales jumped nearly 30% while Tesla's fell. It broke into Europe and outsold Tesla there, tariffs and all. And think about how significant that is. Europe is not some easy, unprotected market. It is the home of Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Ferrari, the most prestigious car brands on Earth with the most demanding drivers. The European Union even slapped extra tariffs on Chinese electric cars specifically to protect its own industry, making them artificially more expensive. And BYD still outsold Tesla there anyway. When you can win in your rival's home stadium, with the referee working against you, that is not a fluke. That is a fundamental shift in who makes the better product for the money. And meanwhile, the biggest Western carmaker in China, Volkswagen, watched its market share in that country get cut nearly in half over a decade, and began planning to cut tens of thousands of jobs, in part because of the ground it lost to Chinese rivals. Read that again. The company that went to China to teach it how to build cars is now cutting jobs at home because its students learned too well. There is a grim lesson in that for every industry, not just cars. Short-term profit, handed over in exchange for long-term dominance, is one of the worst trades a company can ever make. The Western carmakers got their quarterly profits. China got the knowledge to build an empire. Years from now, business schools will study this as one of the great strategic blunders of the modern age. The century the West was so busy counting its profits that it trained the very competitor that would come to eat its lunch. So step back and look at the bigger picture, because this is a pattern you have seen again and again on this channel, and it keeps ending the same way. The West builds a commanding lead in some critical industry. It grows comfortable, certain that lead is permanent. It even hands over its knowledge for short-term profit, sure that no one could ever truly catch up. And then China, patient and relentless, absorbs everything, changes the rules of the game, and comes out ahead. Solar panels, batteries, phones, drones, high-speed rail, and now the single biggest, most valuable consumer product of them all, the car. Each time the West laughs at first, and each time the laughter stops. The great irony is almost poetic. The West was so confident in its lead that it was willing to be paid to train its own replacement. It looked at China and saw a cheap factory, a place to make easy money, a student who would always need the teacher. It never imagined the student would one day build a better school. Elon Musk laughed at BYD in 2011 because, at that moment, the idea was genuinely laughable. The company was small, its products unremarkable, its ambitions absurd. But while the West was laughing, China was building, quietly, patiently, battery by battery, factory by factory, year by year, until one day the joke was not funny anymore. So let us go back to where we started, that laugh in 2011. At the time, Musk was right to laugh by every visible measure. BYD was a nobody. Tesla was the future. The West owned the road, as it always had. But the thing about a laugh like that is what it reveals. It reveals that you are not paying attention, that you think the game is already won, that you cannot imagine the person in front of you ever becoming a threat. And that is exactly the moment a real competitor loves, because while you are laughing, they are working. 14 years later, the company that got laughed at sells more electric cars than anyone on Earth. And the car in your driveway, the one you thought represented the peak of Western engineering, is now competing with machines from a country the West did not take seriously until it was too late. Consider just how fast this happened. Most industrial revolutions take generations. This one took about 15 years. In 2011, a Chinese electric car was a punchline. By 2025, a Chinese company was the #1 electric car seller on the planet, expanding across Europe, Asia, South America, and beyond, while the Western giants scrambled to respond. 15 years to go from joke to king. There is almost no precedent for an industry this large, this complex, and this dominated, shifting its center of power so quickly. And it is not slowing down. China is now pushing into the next frontiers, self-driving technology, even more advanced batteries that charge in minutes, cars packed with software and artificial intelligence. The lead once taken is widening, not shrinking. The West invented the car, but it may not be the West that decides its future. And the most important question in the auto industry is no longer which Western brand is best. It is a much bigger one. If China can win the car, the hardest, biggest, most established industry the West ever built, then what exactly is safe? If this changed how you think about the car in your driveway, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. And here is my question for you. If a Chinese electric car matched a Western one on quality but cost half the price, would you actually buy it? Tell me in the comments.